I'm Edward October. The sound you hear is sleepy time in your childhood bedroom on Halloween night. This is the start of Octoberpod. Before we continue with tonight's entertainment, I'd like to go on the record with my sober assurance that no blood will be curdled or spilt. There's no clanking chains, no cobwebs, no bony and or hairy hands appearing from secret panels or, better still, bedroom curtains. If it's any part of that dear old phosphorescent foolishness that people who don't like ghost stories don't like, let me promise you, we haven't got it. Not tonight. Go listen to some other program. After all, frightening Halloween specials are a dime a dozen on this or any other platform. What we do have are bedtime stories, ones that monster kids of all ages can enjoy. Sometimes you want your heart to be warmed. Sometimes you want your spine to tingle. Tonight, let Octoberpod be a warm blanket. You see, we first experience Halloween as children. To a child, Halloween isn't about zombies, peril, and bloody gore. It's about fun, and candy, and mystery, and dressing up as your favorite superhero on the last night of the month. And that's the Halloween spirit we want to deliver tonight. Tonight's Octoberpod is dedicated to the child inside all of us, regardless of age. One comment that I get most frequently is that I have a very soothing voice. More than once, I've been told I should narrate bedtime stories because Octoberpod puts people to sleep. And as someone who frequently switches on a Hammer horror picture or an episode of Suspense or The Shadow to doze off, I take this as a high compliment. For all of you who've ever wanted to be lulled to sleep by the drone of my voice, tonight's the night. What follows are parodies of beloved horror movies retold as family-friendly bedtime stories. We've obviously made a great deal of modifications to fit them into the mold of a fairy story to soothe you to sleep on Halloween or any other rainy night. For the adults listening, you might have fun trying to figure out which movies we're parodying. The last segment even throws in cartoon characters who might bear a satirical resemblance to someone from your childhood. Comment below with your guesses. Remember, we have our tongues planted in our cheeks tonight, lovingly poking fun at the movies we love. And our mission tonight is relaxation, not thrills. So the only sounds you will hear are my voice and the ambient soundscape that's already playing. There'll be no jarring music stings, no jump scares, no frightening imagery. Now, are you cuddled up under your favorite blanket? Good. Let's get to it then. The Boy Who Loved Halloween. Tommy Doyle was having a no-good, rotten, very bad Halloween. To start off with, his parents, like a lot of parents in his town, had to go away to a dumb old business conference. So he'd have to spend Halloween night with the babysitter. Now his sitter, Lori, was awfully nice. That wasn't the problem. The problem was her little brother, Mikey. Mikey was the weird kid in school. He always wore masks and costumes, even when it wasn't Halloween. No one wanted to sit with him at lunch, and bullies always picked on him. But that wasn't even half of Tommy's problems. As he was leaving school, Tommy slipped and fell on the prize-winning pumpkin he'd brought to show and tell. The pumpkin smashed, and he got pumpkin guts all over the astronaut costume he was wearing. He didn't have time to worry about it, however, because just at that moment, Lori pulled up to pick him and Mikey up from school. When they got to Lori's house, Lori asked Tommy why the long face. He explained to her about the pumpkin ruining his costume. And Mikey said, "Is that all? Come with me. We'll get you fixed up in a jiffy." The two boys went up to Mikey's room while Lori baked a frozen pizza. Tommy had never been up to his room before and was amazed to see Mikey's collection of Halloween masks and all sorts of neat monster junk on the wall. Mikey had models of all the famous monsters, horror movie posters, and several magic kits. Mikey got out a paper grocery bag, some Elmer's glue, some green paint, and black yarn. And in less time than it takes to tell, the boys had made a neato Frankenstein mask, just like in the movies. Some old, ill-fitting clothes completed the look. And just like that, Tommy had a new costume for trick-or-treating. As for Mikey, he put on his Star Trek costume, complete with Captain Kirk mask. When they went downstairs to eat their pizza, Tommy slapped his knee in frustration. "Now what?" Lori asked. "I forgot to bring my trick-or-treat sack," Tommy explained. Mikey just waved his hand. "Don't worry, I've got you covered. Besides, whatever sack you would have brought would have been too small." And then Mikey brought out 2 trick-or-treat sacks the size of pillowcases. Tommy said those were much too big, but Mikey reassured him. "Just stick with me, and by the end of the night, both of these sacks will be so full of treats, we'll barely be able to carry them home." They all loaded up in the car, and Mikey told Lori which neighborhoods to drive to. Mikey knew where all the best houses were. The ones that gave out the most candy, the ones that gave out full-size Snickers bars, and the ones that gave out homemade treats like popcorn balls and toffee apples. And, true to his word, by the end of the night, those sacks were so heavy they could barely drag them to the car. After trick-or-treating, they returned to the house and Lori popped some popcorn. Mikey led Tommy into the living room and switched on the TV. He had looked up when all of the TV channels would be showing monster movies that night. They'd start watching a movie on one channel, and then when a commercial came on, switch to another channel, where they'd watch part of another monster movie until a commercial came on there, and then they'd switch back to the first movie. They managed to watch so many groovy movies that way. Movies like The Thing from Another World, Forbidden Planet, and Night of the Living Dead. And those 2 boys dozed off right there on the couch, bathed in the bluish flicker of the TV screen, and covered with popcorn kernels and candy wrappers. Lori didn't even bother making them go to bed. She just covered them up with a blanket and let them sleep on the couch. And so, Tommy Doyle's no good, rotten, very bad Halloween turned out to be the best Halloween he'd ever had. The best Halloween he would ever have. And after that day, he and Mikey were the best of friends. Tommy began sitting with Mikey at lunchtime and was quick to stick up for him whenever he was bullied. And they went trick-or-treating together every year after that. And even when they grew to be very old, they'd take their children and grandchildren trick-or-treating together. And they were best friends forever, until the end of their days. Ghosty Motel. Once upon a time, there was a young woman named Marion. And even though she worked at a bank, she didn't have very much money. She wanted to marry her boyfriend and settle down someplace nice, maybe buy a house. But settling down simply wasn't in the budget. One fine day, the bank manager handed her an envelope of cash, lots of cash, that some foolish old man had wanted to deposit. The bank manager didn't want to keep that much money in the small vault overnight, so he asked Marion to drive it over to the main branch of the bank and deposit it in the big vault. Except Marion didn't do that. No, she placed the envelope in her purse and went home and packed a suitcase and got in her car and drove all night. She had no idea why she had done that. She supposed seeing all that money drove her a little mad and made her think that if she took it, then it would solve all of her problems. But of course, it would only create more problems for her. Marion drove until very late at night, and would have kept on driving too, but she drove into a rainstorm and could barely see the road ahead of her. So she pulled over for the night at a roadside motel out in the middle of nowhere. The motel was old and run down. So old and run down that it looked like a ghosty motel. Of course, it wasn't haunted by any real ghosts. Not really. But if I was a ghost looking to haunt someone, that motel would be a dandy place to do it. Marian booked a room for the night, and the first thing she wanted to do was take a nice long shower. So she went to check out the bathroom, and when she pulled back the shower curtain, squeak, 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 out from the shower flew dozens of bats, which scared poor Marian so badly that she ran off into the woods, never to be heard from again. Back in her hometown, everyone was beginning to wonder what had happened to Marian. Her sister Lila and her boyfriend Sam hired a detective to find her. The detective retraced Marian's steps until, at last, he found his way to the rundown motel in the middle of nowhere, which looked like a ghosty motel, but which wasn't really haunted at all. The detective saw her car parked out front and asked the manager to let him inspect her room. There he found Marian's luggage and, most curious of all, the envelope of stolen cash. But no Marian. The detective noticed that on a hill overlooking Marian's home, there stood an old dark house, which looked even more haunted than the motel did. The detective went over to the house to explore. He knocked on the door, and when no one answered, he invited himself in to investigate further. He saw a grand old staircase, and he decided to climb the stairs to look for clues. When all of a sudden, squeak, 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 out from a room at the top of the stairs flew dozens of bats, which scared the poor detective so badly that he ran off into the woods, never to be heard from again. Lila and Sam became worried when they didn't hear from the detective they had hired, so they decided to investigate for themselves. They retraced the detective's steps as he had retraced Marian's steps, until at last they found the rundown motel in the middle of nowhere, which looked like a ghosty motel, but which wasn't really haunted at all. They found Marian's car, the empty motel room, Marian's suitcase, and the envelope of stolen cash, and they too found the old house on the hill. They went inside the house to investigate further, but unlike the detective, they looked in the basement. The basement was dark, and the steps down to it were uneven. Lila switched on the basement light to keep from tripping, when all of a sudden, squeak, 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 out from a dark corner of the basement flew dozens of bats, which scared poor Lila and Sam so badly that they ran off into the woods, never to be heard from again. They were never heard from again because in the woods they found a little off-grid farm powered by solar energy, where people were growing organic crops. Best of all, they found Marian and the detective, who, after being scared away by the bats, decided to start a new life with the organic farmers and help them work the land. Marian was in charge of making apple butter and baked goods from apples harvested from their small apple orchard. The detective discovered that he was a natural at keeping bees and harvesting wildflower honey. Lila and Sam were so pleased to see them, and so enchanted by farm life, that they too decided to live simply and sustainably on the farm. And when I say they were never heard from again, cousin, they wouldn't have it any other way. Irena and the Witch's Curse. Irena was a naive young lady who was born and raised in a faraway land before moving to an enchanted island called Manhattan. More than anything in the world, Irena loved to visit the Central Park Zoo, and she tried to visit several times each week. There she would sit for hours drawing the mighty panther as it prowled about its cage. One day she met a young man named Oliver, who was very impressed with her drawings of the big cats. He too was an artist, but one of a very different sort. He was an architect who worked at drawing up plans for skyscrapers and apartment buildings. The two struck up a friendship and soon began going on lunch dates together. Not long after that, they fell in love with one another, and Oliver began speaking to Irena about getting married. But such talk made Irena sad. She would say, "Oh, darling, I would love to marry you, but I dare not." "But why?" asked Oliver. And Irena would explain that it was all because of the witch's curse. Years ago in the old country, she explained, there was an old witch whose heart was full of malice. Somehow the witch became angry at Irena's family and placed a curse on Irena's head when she was still only a baby. "If this one should ever marry," said the witch, "she will turn into a massive black cat with sharp black teeth, fearsome claws, and eyes like coals of fire. She will spread terror and misery to all that she loves, and she will never know happiness." Irena told this story solemnly and said, "There are a handful of us out there who bear such a curse, and sadly I am one of them." Oliver just laughed and laughed when he heard that story. "There are no evil witches, Irena. There are no curses. This is just a childish fear that's followed you to adulthood." After a while, Irena began to believe Oliver and agreed to marry him. On the day Oliver and Irena said their vows, they invited all of their friends out to their favorite restaurant to have a wedding celebration. It was a cold evening, and snow fell from the sky and blanketed the streets. Towards the end of the dinner, a strangely beautiful woman walked up to Irena and spoke to her. No one understood what she said, for she spoke a foreign language. But Irena understood her, and the rest of the night she seemed sad and lost in thought. Months passed, and the newlyweds were happy enough, until a series of strange events began to happen all over the city. A large black panther had been prowling the streets. A woman said the panther chased her through Central Park late one night. Another night, a woman claimed a panther growled at her while waiting for the bus. Finally, a woman who worked at Oliver's drafting office said that she saw the shadow of a panther stalking her while she was swimming laps after work at the YMCA pool. Whenever she heard of such incidents or read about them in the paper, Irena would look at Oliver and say, "You see, I told you, this must have happened while I was sleeping. I must have turned into a panther while I slept to terrorize those poor women, and then I returned only to wake up as myself again. I told you nothing good would come of me marrying you." Again, Oliver would laugh and say the curse was all in her head, and that surely there was some rational explanation. Finally, the newspapers announced that the panther who'd been terrorizing the city had been caught. It was an ordinary panther that had escaped from the zoo. Oliver showed the newspaper to Irena, who was instantly relieved. This proved to her once and for all that the curse was nothing but a load of superstitious nonsense. And yet, now that she was free of her lifelong fear, Irena realized that she didn't need to marry some man to be happy. And so she and Oliver parted ways, but promised to remain friends. Eventually, Irena moved to an ivy-covered cottage in the suburbs, where she lived with a wise black alley cat named Simone. Best of all, there was a big old tree growing out back. It had a knothole in it, which Irena used as a magic mailbox to write letters to her friend, a beautiful woman in white. But that's a story for another time.
Dad, I'm not sleepy yet. Can we have one more story?
Okay, just one more story, but it's getting late. It's almost the witching hour. On a dark and stormy night. One night, there was a terrible storm. The wind howled, Lightning flashed, thunder rumbled, and rain fell by the bucketful. And Bentley Bat, Chester Quail, and Nutso were driving through it, down an old country road in an old-timey car. And those old-timey cars were bad at keeping out the rain. Icy raindrops would leak through the ceiling, drip onto their hats, and trickle down the backs of their necks. Chester Quail was driving, and the farther he drove, the worse it stormed. And the worse it stormed, the harder it was for him to see, and the angrier he became. Bentley Bat was in the passenger seat, trying to read a map which had absorbed so much water that it was now just a big ball of mush. Their friend Nutso, a skunk who had been raised by squirrels, was stretched out in the back seat, cracking jokes. They drove through the storm until they came to a spot in the road where they couldn't go any farther because a tree had fallen, blocking their path. They were just contemplating spending the night in the car when, all of a sudden, Bentley noticed a light off in the distance, coming from an old dark house. So they gathered up their things and sprinted out to it through the wind and rain and thunder. When they knocked on the door, it was answered by Dr. Goosely Von Gander and his butler Gorilla, who quickly ushered them inside. They showed the three friends into the banquet hall of the old house. It was a large room split into a dining area with a long banquet table and a living area. The living area had at its center a grand, ornate fireplace with a warm and cheerful fire crackling on the hearth. In front of the fireplace sat two overstuffed couches with a large pluffy rug between them. Bentley, Chester, and Nutso dashed to the fireplace to begin drying off their wet things and warming their hands and tail feathers by the fire. Dr. Von Gander explained that they were just about to serve dinner and told Gorilla to set 3 more places at the table when, all of a sudden, there came a knock at the door. And before anyone could answer it, Betsy Bat and Hester Quail burst through the door, whooping and hollering, with the wind blowing rain and leaves into the house. Indeed, the wind was blowing so hard that even burly old Gorilla had trouble closing the door behind them. Betsy and Hester explained that they were on their way to meet their boyfriends, Bentley and Chester, when they too became stranded. Dr. Von Gander told them they were in the right place and took the 2 girls into the banquet hall to be reunited with their friends. And then they quickly began drying off their wet things and warming their hands and tail feathers by the fire. Dr. Von Gander instructed Gorilla to set out 2 more places at the dinner table. Soon they were all seated, and when Gorilla brought out a big serving platter of roast beef, Chester smacked his lips and said, roast beef, boy oh boy oh boy. If ever there was a night for roast beef, it's tonight. While Gorilla sliced the roast beef, Dr. Von Gander walked around with a big dish of roasted potatoes, saying, have a potato, have a potato, have a potato, until finally he came to Nutso and said, have a potato. Nutso smiled and said, gosh, thank you. I should love a potato. And so they sat and ate, while the storm raged outside with no sign of ever letting up. Bentley asked if Dr. Von Gander and Gorilla lived all alone in this big house, and the doctor said no, that they lived with his father, Sir Solomon Von Gander, but that he was too old and sick to join them for supper. And that's when Betsy Bat and Hester Quail had the big idea to make a plate of supper for Sir Solomon and bring it up to his room. Old Sir Solomon was unaccustomed to visitors, but was delighted to see all of the young people coming to visit him. While the old goose ate his supper, Chester found an old record player and some records. He began playing some dance music, and Hester started showing everyone some dance moves she'd learned as a singer and dancer at the Drury Lane Theatre in London. Pretty soon, everyone was dancing. Even old Sir Solomon himself began tapping his foot to the rhythm. But he quickly grew tired and said that he'd be turning in for the night. And so as they all left, they came to a room at the top of the stairs. Dr. Von Gander said that this was his room, and that he'd be calling it a night as well. And so, when the 5 stranded travelers returned to the room with the fireplace, they saw that Gorilla had left out some pillows and blankets for them. Bentley and Betsy snuggled up on one couch, Chester and Hester snuggled up on the couch opposite, and Nutso, being too tall and lanky for either couch, made his bed on the fluffy rug in front of the fire. The storm roared on, and they all chatted a bit in the firelight. Bentley and Betsy spoke of vacations they'd like to take and exotic places they'd like to visit. Nutso told funny stories about clumsy things he's done. Best of all, Hester told stories of working at the theater. But then Chester began telling boring stories about working for his rich uncle and put everyone to sleep, including himself. And outside, the wind howled, lightning flashed, thunder rumbled in the distance, and torrents of rain streamed down the eaves and gushed from clogged gutters. But inside, everything was warm and toasty and exceedingly comfortable. The air smelled of mulling spices and applewood smoke. And that's the story of how 5 stranded travelers spent a dark and stormy night in the old dark house. Good night. Pleasant dreams.
Stick around after the credits for a brief word from some of our fellow indie podcasters, creators, and friends. There may even be some bloopers and outtakes as well. You have been listening to Octoberpod. Octoberpod is produced, edited, and directed by Edward October. The series co-producer is MJ McAdams. Logo and banner graphics by Jessica Good. Edward October illustrations based upon an original character design by Nick Calavera. Select still photography courtesy of Unsplash.com. Select music cues by Dr. Dreamchip, various stock music and sound effects courtesy of freesound.org. Music cues from Bigfoot Apocalypse and Thorax, theme from Octoberpod, composed by Nico Vitese. All other images and music FX cues, except where noted, are sourced from within the public domain. Watch Octoberpod home video on YouTube for new videos each month. Follow us on Instagram and on the dumpster fire formerly known as Twitter at OctoberpodVHS and on TikTok and Blue Sky at Octoberpod. Or find all of our links on the World Wide Web at OctoberpodVHS.com. For business inquiries or story submissions, email octoberpod@gmail.com. If you enjoyed Octoberpod, we'd be very pleased if you told your friends about us. And comment with a 5-star or equivalent rating wherever you're listening. The man who spoke to you was Mr. Edward October.
When you're alone in your house, but you'd like to feel like you're not, the podcast inside your house can keep you company. Our show will make sure that you run up the stairs at night when you turn off the lights and check under your bed before you sleep. We'll fill your dreams and nightmares with bizarre birds, creepy crawlers, and heroic hitmen. We'll have you pulling back the shower curtain, just in case, and side-eyeing your closets as you walk past them. We'll bring you everything from the classics that you know and love to the strange and often silly world of creepypastas. We've even got some stories written just for the show that you won't hear anywhere else. So go check out the podcast inside your house. We're on all major platforms, as well as inside your pantry, your crawl space, and sitting at the foot of your bed at night, watching you sleep.
If you like weird, spooky, and strange history, then I have the podcast for you. My name is Brenda, and I'm the host of Horrifying History. Are you into the dark side of history? Horrifying History tells you about the side of history that people don't normally talk about. We tell the tales of haunted places, infamous true crimes, the paranormal, and unsolved mysteries, and then we look to history to see where the truth actually lies. Want to get spooky with us? Get your Horrifying History fix by subscribing today on Spotify, Spreaker, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts.
I'm Annie from Boston, Massachusetts.
And I'm Johanna from Vienna, Austria. We are the hosts of Fresh Hell, your international podcast that covers murder, mystery, and the macabre throughout history. Are you interested in the 3,569 ways your household could have killed you in the Victorian era?
Do you know how malaria and syphilis played a role in the John List family murders?
And have you ever wondered what Prince Albert's sex chair had to do with the murder of Stanford White? Okay, nothing. It had nothing to do with it. We're still telling you about it, though.
It's a pretty great sex chair. If you're looking for another show that talks about Ted Bundy, this is probably not the podcast for you. But if you're looking for two women that cover lesser-known cases from all over the world with a lot of background information.
So much background information that you will rock your local pub quiz from now on.
Then find Fresh Hell Podcast on your favorite podcast app.
We also have German cannibals.
See you soon.
Tschüss.
Do you have to throw on your favorite true crime podcast before bed in order to fall asleep? Same. And it's the very reason that I created Serial Napper. My name is Nikki Young, and I'm here to lull you to sleep or perhaps to give you nightmares with some of the craziest true crime stories that you've never heard of. Each episode of Serial Napper features a different true crime story told succinctly the way that it happened. Just the facts, ma'am. My focus is on unsolved crimes that need more attention, cold cases, and wrongful convictions. While true crime shows can sometimes be graphic in nature, I ensure that the story is told in a way that is respectful to the victims and their families. Now, when it's time for bed, you can look forward to 30 minutes of well-researched and detailed case files while you get your beauty sleep. Find Serial Napper on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you like to listen to podcasts. Sweet dreams.